All right, I promise no existential Jewish philosophy today. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Before I get started with what I wanted to say, let me start my clock so I don't run out of time. I wanted to start on a personal note and say that I was born on a small farm about an hour outside Atlanta, Georgia, and I'll actually be flying to the farm to spend the American Thanksgiving holiday with my dad tomorrow morning. But I say that to say that it's a real honor and privilege to be here with you in this room. I feel like I'm beginning Thanksgiving among kindred spirits. The second thing I want to say is that the irony is not lost on me that we're beginning today talking about geopolitics when it's probably domestic Canadian politics that has been creating the most headaches for you recently. I'm thinking of this train union workers' strike. I'm glad to see that it's probably on the way to resolution, but I think it actually shines a nice light on sort of an underappreciated part of geopolitics, which is that the aphorism that all politics is ultimately local is true, and that's true for geopolitics as well. But also when you start thinking about some of the geopolitical forces that I'm going to be describing to you today, you really can't even begin to deal with them if in your own country you don't have a good cohesive sense of what your place is in the world, and at least some base level perspective on how to achieve that together as a society. Now, I'm coming to you from the United States where we have no agreement on this whatsoever right now. And I read the Globe and Mail today, and it's nice to see that you all have a little bit of disagreement on that too, but that's going to be more important in some ways than anything I'm going to tell you. But that's not what I'm good at, and that's not what I'm here to talk about. So let me talk about geopolitics. If you take three things away from what I have to say today, it's these key bullet points. Number one, geopolitics is back, and the world is going to get a lot more geopolitical over the course of the next 20 to 30 years. And I'll try to describe what that looks like for us. Second of all, that's bad for the world. It's an unambiguously bad thing when the world is more geopolitical. That means more risk, it means more volatility, it means more violent conflict. Third, though, and on what I hope is a more optimistic note, it's not necessarily a bad thing for you. If you can properly align some of your business interests, some of these broad geopolitical forces I'm talking about, I think there are opportunities out there in the world for you. And to be frank, there aren't many places in the world I would rather be a grain farmer in 2019 than Western Canada. We'll see how good I make that argument. Now, the bulk of my talk is going to be about the 5 biggest geopolitical forces I think are going to be shaping the world. But before I get there, let's spend a few minutes on how we got here in the first place. Now, geopolitics itself is a rarely new concept. It's a new word. It was coined in 1899 by a Swedish professor named Rudolf Kjellén. Has anyone ever heard of Rudolf Kjellén? No, there's no reason that you should have. But he was remarkably prescient. Now, imagine for a second you're not in Western Canada, but you're a Swedish professor in 1899, and you're looking at what's going on in the world around you. What you see is a world of rising and falling great powers. So on the one hand, you have a rising German power across the water in the European continent. You have Japan rising in the east, the United States rising in the west. You also have declining powers. You have a British Empire that looks like it's running out of steam. You have a Russian Empire that's about to be torn apart, and you have an Ottoman Empire that's about to fall. Now, we don't remember Kjellén's name, but he was remarkable because this concept of geopolitics that he developed really governed international relations for almost a century. From about 1899 to 1991, geopolitics was king, and it dominated all of international relations. World War I gives way to World War II, gives way to the Cold War. And these are all fundamentally geopolitical conflicts where land and resources are being fought over by nations. And then something happens in 1991, the Soviet Union collapses, and it all goes away for 20 years. And suddenly geopolitics becomes obsolete. And in this 20-year interregnum, the United States and Canada and other of the Western allies think that finally the forward march of human progress is going to go forward. And all these countries that were stuck behind the Iron Curtain, globalization is going to lift all boats, and democracy is going to come to them, and everything is going to be fine. Well, it didn't happen that way, right? And 4 key things happened that kind of blocked that progress. The first was September 11th. September 11th was really the first articulate rejection of this expansion of the world order. Now, jihadism was just one outgrowth of it, but what it really was fundamentally was Muslim societies saying, what we didn't really like the last 100 years, why should we trust you now? Nothing's been good for us. We don't want your values. We don't want your globalization. We want our traditions and we want our culture. That was September 11th in a nutshell. The United States, as it does, and this is the second thing that happens, completely overreacts to 9/11. The United States really has trouble functioning in the world when it doesn't have an enemy that it can focus on, and jihadism was just the perfect enemy. And so the United States decides it's going to take out jihadism and declare a war on terror. And it begins in Afghanistan, and then disastrously, it moves to Iraq in 2003. And it was a disaster for two key reasons. The first is that there was no chance that Iraq was going to become a liberal democracy. It wasn't going to happen. But the second and deeper problem was that by taking out the Saddam Hussein regime, as morally satisfying and justifying as it was, completely messed up the balance of power in the Middle East, and it unleashed Iran on the rest of the Middle East. Suddenly you had a revisionist power in the Middle East, and suddenly geopolitics was back. A third thing happened a couple years later. Russia returns to history. So Russia goes through a couple years of chaos after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and then they trust their future to Vladimir Putin, and suddenly they're off to the races. And right around the time that everybody is consumed with the great financial crisis and everything that's happening in global markets, Putin decides to make his move and he invades Georgia in August 2008. Now, he does this again, two reasons. The first is that he's telling the world, I reject this idea of a global order that Russia has to be a part of. I want to go back in time. I want a Russian sphere of influence, and I want an American sphere of influence, and I want you to stay in your zone, and I'll stay in my zone and leave me alone. But the second thing is that he wants to completely undermine the idea of a U.S. security guarantee. The Georgians really thought the Americans were going to come to their rescue, and the Russians bet, and bet correctly, that after the disaster in Iraq, there was going to be no political will in the United States to do that. And so geopolitics returned to the Caucasus, to Eastern Europe, and to Central Asia. Now, the last thing that happened, and this might be the most consequential of all of them, was the rise of Xi Jinping in China. China has had really three world historical figures in its last 100 years. The first was Mao Zedong. He reunited China. The second was Deng Xiaoping. He made China rich. Xi Jinping is here to make China strong. And it's not a coincidence that Xi has risen just around the time that China's economic growth model has to fundamentally restructure itself. We'll talk about this more in a little bit, but in 1980, China basically throws communism out with the bathwater and says, we like capitalism, and their economy explodes because of it. And they become the low-cost factory of the world. And it works really well right up until about 2008. And then the model sort of collapses, and China has to effect this massive reconstruction. It's not a coincidence that Xi Jinping emerged out of that situation. And so geopolitics, again, returns to Asia, returns to South Asia, returns to the South Pacific, even with competition in Africa and South America as a result of China. So that's our geopolitical world, and that's how we got here. But what's going to happen next? That's what I actually get paid to say, right? I think there are 5 key forces that we need to understand if we're going to understand the shape of the world, not just next year, but out to about 2040 or 2050. And they are this: renewed strategic competition over resources, especially arable land, especially water, and especially food. Number 2 is the maturation of Chinese power. Number 3 is the rise of Indian power. Number 4 is what I call the Muslim Civil War and its continuation. And 5, what I've been calling America's Victorian era.